Somewhere beneath the Giza plateau, pressed into limestone that has not seen light in 9,000 years, there is a groove. Not a crack, not a fracture left by time. A groove smooth, deliberate cut by a hand that knew exactly where to stop. No name sits beside it. No inscription. No dynasty claims it. Just the silent memory of pressure against stone left by someone who understood this rock before Egypt had a word for king. Dust has filled it now, layer upon layer, century folding over century until the groove became invisible to everyone walking above. But it is still there, still holding the shape of a tool that history never recorded, still waiting in the dark like a sentence no one finished. You are not here by accident. Something quieter than curiosity brought you to this moment, a rhythm older than history, older than language, older than the sand that buried these marks. You have felt it before in the weight of a stone ruin you could not explain, in the silence of a place that felt too still, too heavy, with something unnamed. That rhythm led you here. It has been leading people here for thousands of years. What if everything we were taught about civilization is not a line moving forward, but a circle? What if the builders of Giza did not invent their knowledge, but inherited it from hands that worked in shadow, beside lakes, in a green Sahara that have since turned to ash and dust? What if the greatest monument on earth is not a beginning, but a memory of something even older? Tonight, we walk backward through that circle, past the pharaohs, past the first dynasties, into the ancient dark where stone still holds the fingerprints of the forgotten. Stay with me, let's drift a little deeper. Close your eyes now and picture this. Not the Egypt of postcards and museum glass, not the Egypt of golden masks and tourist cameras, but the earth itself, the raw and breathing ground beneath all of that. Imagine standing on the Giza plateau 11,000 years ago, long before the first block was ever cut, long before the first pharaoh drew breath. The air is not dry. It is thick and warm and sweet, with the smell of wet grass bending under a sky that has just finished raining. The limestone beneath your feet is dark with moisture, and where the water has pooled in shallow depressions across the rock, it reflects a sky so full of stars that it seems the ground itself is holding light. There is no city, there is no road, there is only stone, water, wind, and the vast silence of a world that does not yet know it will one day be called ancient. This is where we begin. Not with a date or a dynasty, but with the feeling of standing on ground that remembers everything. 'Cause stone is memory. Every crack in limestone is a sentence written by pressure. Every vein of quartz running through granite is a diary entry left by heat and time, compressed into something you can touch with your fingertips. If you kneel close enough in the fading light, the plateau at this hour in this forgotten age is not a construction site. It is a living surface breathing slowly, the way all geology breathes in, rhythms too long for any single human life to notice, in exhales that take centuries, in inhales that last millennia. The dust has not yet come. The desert has not yet arrived. What exists here now is green and soft and impossibly alive. To the west, the Sahara stretches not as sand, but as savanna, a rolling carpet of short grasses and scattered acacia trees that shimmer in the heat of afternoon and cool into silver under moonlight. Small lakes dot the landscape like mirrors left on the floor of an enormous room, each one surrounded by reeds that hiss quietly when the wind passes through them. Herds of cattle move in slow arcs across the plain, their bodies casting long shadows that slide over the earth like the hands of a clock no one built. The people who tend these herds walk barefoot over ground that is warm from the sun but not yet punishing, not yet the furnace it will become. They know the names of every waterhole within a week's walk. They know which stones hold heat longest after sunset. They know the sound the wind makes when it changes direction before a storm. This is not primitive knowledge. This is intimacy with the earth so deep it has no need for written language. It lives in the body. It passes through hands. Now let the night settle. Let the last edge of sunlight slip below the western horizon, and watch as the sky transforms from amber to violet, to a darkness so complete it feels like velvet pressed against your face. This is the ancient night, and night without electricity, without glass, without any barrier between the human eye and the full weight of the cosmos. The Milky Way does not appear as a faint smudge here. It blazes. It pours across the sky like a river of crushed light so bright that it casts faint shadows on the ground below. Orion rises in the east, and his belt, those 3 steady points of light, hangs above the plateau at an angle that will not exist again for another 26,000 years. The people who sleep beneath this sky do not call them Orion's belt. They have older names. Names spoken in languages that left no alphabet, no clay tablet, no carved wall. But the names existed. And the watching existed. And the quiet understanding that those stars returned each year at the same season, marking the rhythm of floods and migrations and births, that understanding was already ancient when these watchers first opened their eyes. Feel the temperature drop now. The stone beneath your back, if you were to lie down on this plateau as those early watchers surely did, releases the heat it stored during the day in a slow, patient exhale. It warms your spine. It holds you the way the earth has always held the bodies that rest upon it, without judgment, without urgency. The limestone is not yet carved. It is not yet shaped into blocks or chambers or corridors. It is simply itself a deposit laid down over millions of years by the shells of tiny sea creatures that lived and died in a warm ocean that covered this ground long before any mammal walked the planet. Calcium carbonate, pressed and compressed and transformed by weight into something solid enough to hold the memory of an entire sea. Erosion is time thinking. And this stone has been thinking for a very long time. Around you in the darkness, the sounds of the green Sahara continue their slow nocturnal symphony. Somewhere to the south, a hippo exhales in a shallow lake, and the sound carries across the flat ground like a deep, wet breath. Insects pulse in the grass, not the sharp buzz of desert flies, but the layered rhythmic hum of creatures that thrive near water, their sounds rising and falling in waves that seem to match your own breathing if you let them. A nightjar calls once from the edge of a wadi, its voice thin and clear, and then falls silent as if it spoke only to confirm that the night is real. The air smells of damp earth and crushed herbs, the scent of a landscape that receives rain regularly, that knows the weight of clouds, the way a child knows the weight of a parent's hand. This is not the Egypt of dust and ash, not yet. This is the Egypt of water and shadow and green growing things. And beneath all of this, beneath the grass, beneath the pooled rain, beneath the warm stone, the plateau holds something else, something that will not be understood for thousands of years. Deep in the bedrock, natural fissures run at angles that follow the geometry of the stone's original formation. These fissures create planes of weakness lines, along which the rock wants to split paths where future hands will find it easiest to cut. The plateau is in a sense already designed, not by any intelligence, but by the physics of sedimentation itself, by the way. Layers of ancient seabed compressed unevenly, creating a hidden architecture of stress and release that mirrors the very principles human builders will later discover on their own. Gravity is memory, and the memory stored in this rock is a blueprint waiting for someone to learn how to read it. But no one is reading it tonight. Tonight the plateau is simply quiet. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient procession. The grass bends, the water settles. Somewhere in the distance, a group of herders sits around a low fire, their faces lit by embers that glow the same orange as the desert that will 6,000 years from now swallow everything they know. They do not know this. They do not know that the rain will stop. They do not know that the lakes will shrink and vanish, that the grass will brown and blow away, that the animals will migrate east toward a river that will become the only source of life in a world turned to sand. They know only tonight. They know the warmth of the fire, the taste of milk, the sound of cattle settling into sleep, and the immense patient silence of a sky that asks nothing and offers everything. This is the atmosphere we enter now. Not the atmosphere of history books where dates line up in neat rows and civilizations begin with a single founding event. This is the atmosphere of deep time, where change happens so slowly it feels like stillness, where 1,000 years can pass and leave nothing behind but a faint discoloration on a stone surface, where the most important things that ever happened left no record at all except the quiet rearrangement of the earth itself. The ground you're lying on tonight, this warm, wet, starlit limestone, will one day hold the largest stone structure ever built by human hands. But that is a story for later. For now, there is only the stone, the sky, the rhythm of insects in the grass, and the slow, ancient breathing of a world that has not yet learned to forget. Let yourself settle into this silence. Let the weight of the night press you gently downward, the way sediment presses against the ocean floor, the way time presses memory into stone. You are not falling. You are not. You are being held. The earth beneath you has been holding things for 4.5 billion years, holding magma, holding water, holding the bones of creatures whose names no science has ever spoken. It can hold you too. It can hold your thoughts, your questions, your quiet wonder at the idea that this place, this exact patch of ground, was once green and wet and full of life that left almost no trace. Almost, because the stone remembers, the dust remembers, and if you listen closely enough in the space between your own heartbeats, you can hear the faintest echo of the rhythm that once moved through this land, a rhythm older than language, older than fire, older than the very idea of building something that might outlast the ones who built it. Stay here. Breathe. The deeper chapters are waiting just beneath the surface the way they have always waited, patient as stone. Evidence does not arrive the way most people imagine. It does not announce itself with trumpets or flashing lights. It accumulates the way silt accumulates at the bottom of a river, the way dust accumulates on a shelf no one touches, the way centuries accumulate inside a single layer of rock so thin you could miss it with a careless thumb. The evidence for a world before Egypt is like this. It did not come all at once. It came in fragments, in whispers, in small moments of confusion, when a geologist knelt beside a wall and noticed something that should not have been there. A groove too deep, a cut too clean, a pattern of erosion that belonged to a climate that had not existed for 8,000 years. Each fragment alone means little, but together laid side by side the way a patient hand lays mosaic tiles into wet plaster, they begin to form something that looks less like coincidence and more like a portrait of a world we were never taught to see. The first piece of evidence is water, or rather the memory of water written into stone. When geologists examined the limestone enclosure surrounding the Great Sphinx in the early 20th century, they found something that did not match the story they had been told. The walls of the enclosure showed deep vertical channels running from top to bottom, carved not by wind but by the slow, persistent falling of rain over centuries. Wind erosion in a desert leaves horizontal marks, long shallow grooves that follow the direction of prevailing gusts, scraping sand across a surface, the way a palm scrapes across a table. But these channels were vertical. They were deep. They followed the unmistakable signature of water flowing downward under gravity, cutting into soft limestone the way a river cuts into a canyon floor. Egypt has not seen rainfall capable of producing such channels since somewhere between 10,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era. That means the stone was already exposed, already standing, already shaped into something worth eroding, at a time when the Sahara was green and wet, and the idea of pharaohs had not yet entered the human imagination. The Sphinx remembers rain, and rain remembers a world that history forgot. The second piece of evidence lies inside the Great Pyramid itself, in the narrow granite chamber known as the King's Chamber. Here the walls are made not of soft limestone but of Aswan granite, one of the hardest building stones on Earth, a crystalline igneous rock that resists cutting the way bone resists breaking. And yet on the surfaces of these granite blocks, engineers have found drill marks, not rough gouges left by hammering, not the irregular scratches of copper chisels dragged across resistant crystal. These are smooth circular boreholes with spiral grooves inside them, grooves that suggest a rotating tool pressing into the stone with consistent force and steady speed. In 1924, engineer Edward Hughes studied these marks and wrote that the cuts showed a precision difficult to reconcile with the tools conventionally attributed to the Fourth Dynasty. His words were careful, measured the words of a man who understood that what he was seeing did not fit the framework he had been given. The drill marks did not shout. They simply existed quiet and precise, waiting in the dark for someone to ask the right question. Stone does not lie. It cannot. It holds exactly what was done to it, no more, no less, and these marks hold the memory of a technique that the official record cannot fully explain. The third piece of evidence is astronomical. When the three pyramids of Giza are viewed from above their relative positions, mirror the three stars of Orion's belt Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. This correlation was noted by several researchers across the 20th century, but what makes it remarkable is not the alignment itself, but the date at which the alignment is most precise. Due to a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the apparent positions of stars over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, the belt of Orion hung at a different angle in the sky at different epochs. When engineers calculated the date at which the pyramid layout most accurately mirrors the stellar pattern, the answer was not 2500 BCE, the conventional date of construction. The answer was closer to 10,500 BCE. This does not prove that the pyramids were built 12,000 years ago, but it suggests that whoever planned their layout possessed knowledge of astronomical cycles that spanned millennia, knowledge that could only come from generations of careful observation passed down through a tradition older than writing itself. The sky is a clock, and someone long before Egypt had a name was already reading it. The fourth piece of evidence is proportion. The Sphinx's head is small, noticeably measurably small compared to the massive body that stretches behind it. Egyptologists have long attributed this to weathering or artistic choice, but some researchers propose a simpler explanation: the head was recarved. If the original monument was shaped during an earlier era, perhaps as a lion or some other form suited to its body's proportions, then a later dynasty may have reshaped only the head to bear the face of a pharaoh, leaving the body untouched, because it was too large, too deeply embedded in the bedrock to alter. The mismatch in scale is subtle enough to overlook, but persistent enough to trouble anyone who measures carefully. A French explorer in 1857 recorded that local workers near the Sphinx spoke of a forgotten king whose face the monument once carried a king older than Menes, the legendary founder of Egypt's first dynasty. Oral memory is not evidence in the forensic sense, but oral memory is how knowledge survived for thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down, and the mismatch in proportion remains carved into the stone, like a question no one has been permitted to answer loudly. The fifth piece of evidence is absence. Beneath the Sphinx, tunnels extend into the bedrock. Some were sealed by ancient hands, others were found accidentally during restoration work. A chamber known as the Osiris shaft lies deep below the causeway, containing 3 descending levels, each carved with greater skill than the one above it. The lowest level holds a stone sarcophagus surrounded by water that seeps through the rock from some hidden source. No inscriptions identify its purpose. No dynasty claims its construction. The walls of this lowest chamber show the same water-worn smoothness found on the Sphinx enclosure, a signature of prolonged exposure to moisture in an era when moisture was abundant. And yet few studies revisit this chamber. Flooding makes access difficult. Funding flows toward questions with predictable answers. The silence around the Osiris shaft is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of a door left closed, because what lies behind it might rearrange the furniture of everything we think we know. These fragments rain. Channels drill mark stellar alignments, mismatched proportions. Sealed chambers do not individually rewrite history. But evidence never works alone. It works the way sediment works. One grain means nothing, but 1,000,000 grains become a riverbed, and a riverbed becomes a landscape, and a landscape becomes the ground on which entire civilizations stand without ever looking down. The evidence for a world before Egypt is beneath your feet right now, pressed into the stone, waiting with the same patience that stone has always possessed. It does not need you to believe it. It only needs you to look. Every structure that human beings have ever built carries within it an assumption. The assumption that the tools available at the time were sufficient to explain the result. A mud brick wall requires mud and hands. A timber frame requires an axe and trees. A pyramid of limestone requires copper chisels, wooden sledges, ramps of rubble, and the organized labor of thousands. This is the story we have been given, and for the most part it holds together the way a well-built wall holds together each fact resting neatly on the one beneath it, each explanation supporting the weight of the next. But every wall has a point of stress. Every structure, no matter how carefully assembled, contains a place where the load shifts, and the material bends, and a faint crack appears not large enough to bring anything down, but large enough to let the light through. The anomaly at Giza is that crack, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It begins with the stone itself. The core blocks of the Great Pyramid are limestone quarried from the plateau and stacked with impressive but explicable skill. But the interior chambers tell a different story. The king's chamber is lined with granite transported from Aswan over 800 kilometers to the south, enormous slabs of igneous rock, each weighing between 25 and 80 tons, lifted to a height of 60 meters and fitted together with joints so tight that a razor blade cannot pass between them. Granite is not limestone. It does not yield to copper. It laughs at soft metal the way a mountain laughs at rain. To shape granite with the tools attributed to the 4th dynasty, dolerite-pounding stones, copper saws fed with abrasive sand, would require not merely effort, but a kind of patience that borders on geological time. Experiments have been conducted. Researchers have attempted to replicate the cuts using period-appropriate tools. The results are consistent, slow, irregular, and imprecise. The granite inside the pyramid is none of these things. It is fast, regular, and precise. The anomaly is not that the granite exists. The anomaly is the distance between what the tools can do and what the stone shows was done. Consider the drill holes. Inside several granite surfaces at Giza, circular bore marks descend into the stone with a spiral groove that suggests rotational cutting under significant pressure. The rate of penetration implied by the spacing of these grooves exceeds what copper and sand can achieve by a measurable margin. This is not speculation, it is measurement. The grooves are there. They can be photographed cast in silicone and studied under magnification. They do not match the expected performance of any tool in the conventional Old Kingdom toolkit. Some researchers propose that harder materials, perhaps corundum or emery, were used as abrasives which would increase cutting speed. Others suggest that the tools themselves were made of something harder than copper, something that did not survive in the archaeological record because it was rare or recycled or simply not preserved. These are reasonable possibilities, but they remain possibilities, not explanations, because no such tools have been found. The drill holes sit in the granite like questions written in a language we almost understand but cannot quite read. They do not fit, and things that do not fit are the most important things in science, because they mark the exact boundary between what we know and what we have only assumed. Now step outside the pyramid and walk toward the Sphinx. Stand in the enclosure and look at the walls. The vertical erosion channels are deeper on the western wall than the eastern wall, consistent with prevailing rainfall patterns. In a wet climate, rain carried by westerly winds would strike the western face more directly, cutting deeper grooves over time. This pattern makes meteorological sense. What it does not make is historical sense, because the conventional timeline places the carving of the Sphinx at approximately 2500 BCE, by which point Egypt had already been arid for thousands of years. The erosion does not match the date. The date does not match the erosion. One of them must be wrong. Geologist Robert Schoch proposed that the Sphinx enclosure was carved much earlier, perhaps around 7000 BCE, or before, when the climate could account for the observed weathering. His proposal was met with resistance, not because the geology was flawed, but because the implication was uncomfortable. If the Sphinx is older than the 4th dynasty, then someone else carved it. And if someone else carved it, then the story we tell about the birth of monumental architecture in Egypt needs a new first chapter. The anomalies do not stop at Giza. Across Egypt, quarries hold marks that do not match the dynasties to which they are assigned. At Wudan al-Faras, basalt blocks show straight extraction channels with parallel grooves marks that differ from the typical pounding signatures of dolerite hammers. At Gebel el-Silsila, deeper layers reveal grid pattern cuts perpendicular to each other, a method not associated with New Kingdom quarrying. At Aswan, away from the famous unfinished obelisk, granite surfaces display horizontal striations so uniform they suggest rapid, even removal of material, a process inconsistent with manual pounding. Each site carries its own small crack, its own quiet departure from the expected. None of these anomalies demand a single dramatic conclusion. They do not require lost civilizations or alien engineers or any of the sensational explanations that make for exciting television but poor science. What they require is simpler and in some ways harder. They require us to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. They require us to hold the crack open instead of plastering over it. Because that is what anomalies are. They are not answers. They are invitations. Invitations to look more carefully, to measure more precisely, to ask whether the story we inherited is the only story the evidence can tell. The crack in the wall does not destroy the wall. It reveals that the wall was built on something deeper, something older, something we have not yet fully excavated. And tonight, as you drift closer towards sleep, let that crack remain open. Let the light come through. You do not need to resolve it. You only need to notice that it is there, quiet, patient, and real, the way all true mysteries are real. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, just waiting. The way the stone has always waited. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to places where something has been lost. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, not the restful silence of a night without wind, but the heavy pressurized silence of a space that once held something important and now holds only the shape of its absence. You have felt this silence before. You feel it in an abandoned house where the wallpaper still shows the outlines of frames that were taken down. You feel it in a library where an entire shelf stands empty and no one remembers what was there. You feel it in the gaps between chapters of a book where pages have been torn out so carefully that the binding shows no damage, only the faint roughness where paper used to be. The history of Egypt before the First Dynasty is filled with this silence. Not the silence of nothing having happened, but the silence of everything having happened, and almost none of it having survived. Consider what we know. Egyptian civilization appears in the historical record with a suddenness that has puzzled scholars for more than a century. Around 300 BCE, the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under a single ruler traditionally identified as Nama or Menes. Within a few centuries, this newly unified culture produced hieroglyphic writing, monumental architecture, complex administrative systems, advanced astronomy, and a medical tradition sophisticated enough to perform surgical procedures described in papyri that would not seem out of place in a Renaissance textbook. The speed of this emergence is by any measure remarkable. Civilizations do not typically spring into existence fully formed. They build upon foundations, they inherit, they refine. They carry forward the slow accumulations of generations that came before them, the way a river carries silt from mountains it will never see again. And yet, when we look for Egypt's foundations for the long gradual development that should precede such sudden sophistication, we find very little. We find fragments, we find hints, and then we find silence. The silence is not accidental. It is geological, climatic, and material. The people who lived in the Nile Valley and the surrounding regions before 3100 BCE built primarily with materials that do not survive the passage of millennia in a floodplain environment. Mud brick dissolves, reed collapses, wood rots, leather crumbles. Woven fabric returns to the soil within centuries unless preserved by the exceptional dryness of desert burial. The annual flood of the Nile, which later became the engine of Egyptian agricultural wealth, was also an engine of erasure, each inundation depositing a new layer of silt over the old burying settlements, compressing structures, dissolving the organic materials that held communities together. Imagine a library where every year a thin layer of wet clay is spread across the floor, covering the lowest shelf of books. After 1,000 years, the bottom shelves are gone. After 5,000 years, only the highest shelves remain, and even those are damp, warped, and incomplete. This is what the Nile did to the record of its earliest inhabitants. It did not destroy with malice. It destroyed with patience, the way water always destroys gently, persistently, one molecule at a time. The Sahara contributed its own form of silence. When the climate shifted around 6000 BCE, the grasslands that had supported pastoral communities for millennia began to dry. Lakes shrank. Rivers retreated underground. The people who had lived beside these waters moved eastward toward the Nile, and behind them the sand advanced, covering their settlements, their stone circles, their hearths, and their shallow graves with a blanket of silica so thorough that entire cultures vanish beneath it. The desert does not preserve the way people assume. It preserves selectively. It keeps bone but dissolves cartilage. It keeps stone but scatters ash. It keeps the hardest, densest objects and lets everything else blow away on winds that have been blowing for 6,000 years without interruption. What remains in the desert is not a record. It is a residue, the last fraction of a fraction, the handful of sand left at the bottom of an hourglass after the glass itself has shattered. And then there is the silence of intention. Not all erasure is natural. Egyptian pharaohs routinely dismantled the monuments of their predecessors, recarving names, repurposing blocks, and absorbing older structures into newer ones. The practice was so common that Egyptologists have a term for it: usurpation. If later dynasties treated even their known predecessors this way, what would they have done with the traces of cultures that existed before the very concept of dynasty? Stones without inscriptions would have been seen simply as building material. Foundations without names would have been built upon without acknowledgement. The silence of the pre-dynastic world is not merely the silence of decay. It may also be the silence of absorption, older knowledge consumed so thoroughly by newer structures that its origins became invisible, the way the roots of a tree become invisible once the trunk has grown tall enough to cast its own shadow. What survives in this silence is small. Pottery shards bearing symbols that do not match any known script, bone tags at Abydos carrying marks that predate hieroglyphs, stone tools polished with a skill that seems too refined for the period to which they are assigned, channels cut into delta soil that are straighter than they should be, quarry marks that use no wedge holes, burial goods that contain materials traded from regions hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting networks of exchange far more organized than the scattered villages they are attributed to. Each of these fragments sits at the edge of the silence, half in light and half in shadow, like objects glimpsed through fog, real enough to touch but not clear enough to name. They are the residue of a world that existed before the record began, a world that shaped everything that came after it but left almost nothing of itself behind. This is the silence you are resting in now. Not an empty silence, but a full one. A silence packed with the compressed memory of everything that was built and lost, everything that was known and forgotten, everything that the river buried and the desert scattered and the wind carried away. It is the silence between heartbeats, the silence between breaths, the silence that exists not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is too deep and too slow to hear with ordinary ears. Let it hold you. The silence is not the end of the story. It is the place where the story waits to be found. There was a time, and this is not myth, not legend, not the romantic invention of writers who wish the past were more interesting than it was. There was a real measurable, geologically verified time when the Sahara was not a desert. The evidence is not ambiguous. It is written in lake sediments, in pollen cores drilled from ancient basins, in the bones of hippopotami, found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest water, in satellite imagery that reveals the ghostly outlines of rivers flowing beneath the sand like veins beneath skin. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era, the region we now call the Sahara received monsoon rains, driven northward by a shift in Earth's axial tilt, a slow, predictable wobble that altered the angle at which sunlight struck the atmosphere, and in doing so moved the rain belt across an entire continent. The result was a landscape that would be unrecognizable to anyone who has only seen the Sahara through the lens of the modern world. Grassland stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Nile. Shallow lakes appeared in basins that are now buried under meters of sand. Crocodiles swam in waters that no longer exist. Elephants grazed on plains that are now among the most lifeless surfaces on Earth. This was not a brief episode. It lasted 5,000 years. 5,000 years of reign, of growth, of green. And people lived in it. Not as scattered, desperate survivors clinging to the edges of an unforgiving world, but as communities, organized mobile adaptive communities, who built stone circles and carved megaliths and herded cattle across distances that would exhaust a modern vehicle. At Nabta Playa, near the Egyptian-Sudanese border, archaeologists uncovered a ceremonial complex dating to approximately 9,000 BCE, that included standing stones aligned with the summer solstice buried sculptures of cattle, carved from sandstone, and a stone calendar circle whose design suggests a sophisticated understanding of annual solar movement. The people who built Nabta Playa were not primitive. They were astronomers. They were planners. They understood the relationship between the position of the sun and the timing of rain, and they encoded that understanding into stone arrangements that have survived 10,000 years of abandonment. They did this without writing. They did this without metal tools. They did this with patience observation and a relationship with the sky so intimate that it became architecture. But Nabta Playa was not alone. Across the Green Sahara, similar sites emerged in patterns that suggest a widespread cultural tradition, rather than isolated experiments. In the Gilf Kabir Plateau region, stone mounds aligned with celestial events stretch across the desert floor in rows too regular to be natural. Near the Jebel Uweinat, massive tall stones lean at angles that suggest they were once upright rough-cut megaliths abandoned when the rain stopped, and the world they were built for ceased to exist. In the Tassili Naja Plateau of Algeria, rock shelters hold paintings of cattle herders, swimmers and dancers surrounded by landscapes of water and abundant scenes, so vivid and so unlike the current environment that early European explorers refused to believe they could have been painted where they were found. The Green Sahara was not a marginal world, it was a rich one, and the people who lived in it were not passing through. They were home. What did they build? This is where the silence from the previous chapter presses hardest against the present one, because the answer is, we do not fully know. Their homes were made of organic materials, wood, reed, animal skin, woven grass, all of which decomposed within centuries of being abandoned. Their tools were made of stone and bone, and many of these have survived, but tools alone do not tell you what a culture built. They tell you what a culture could build, and the tools found across the Green Sahara suggest capabilities that exceed the simple shelters and temporary camps typically attributed to Neolithic pastoral societies. Basalt hand axes polished to mirror smoothness, grinding stones shaped with geometric precision, stone rings and discs whose function remains debated but whose craftsmanship is undeniable. These are not the products of people who lacked skill. These are the products of people whose skill was directed toward materials that did not last. Imagine for a moment what a 5,000-year-old civilization built from wood and reed would look like today. The answer is it would look like nothing. It would look like empty desert. It would look like silence. The only traces that could survive such a span of time in such a climate would be stone, and even stone, if it is small enough, can be buried scattered or mistaken for natural formation. The forgotten epoch is not forgotten because it was unimportant. It is forgotten because it was built from the wrong materials for immortality. The people of the Green Sahara did not build in granite. They built in grass and hide, and the soft wood of acacia trees, and when the rain stopped, and the lakes dried, and the wind began to blow without ceasing, their world dissolved back into the earth, the way a breath dissolves into cold air, completely silently leaving only the faintest trace of warmth where it once was. And then they moved. As the monsoon rains retreated southward and the Sahara began its long transformation into the world's largest desert, the communities who had thrived on its plains migrated eastward. They followed the shrinking water. They followed the last green corridors. They followed the Nile, that long, thin thread of life that remained when everything else had dried, and they settled along its banks, bringing with them 5,000 years of accumulated knowledge, how to read the sky, how to track the seasons, how to manage herds, how to shape stone, how to organize communal labor, how to align structures with the movements of stars. They brought all of this to the Nile Valley, and the Nile Valley absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water, completely invisibly, until the knowledge became indistinguishable from the culture that claimed it as its own. This is the forgotten epoch, not a single dramatic civilization, with a capital city and a king, but a slow, distributed 5,000-year accumulation of skill and knowledge carried by people who followed the rain across a continent and arrived at the Nile with everything they needed to build a civilization, except the desire to leave their names behind. They left something better. They left the foundation. and the foundation is still there, buried beneath the sand, beneath the silt, beneath the pyramids themselves, quiet, patient and older than anything the history books have ever thought to mention. The end of the Green Sahara was not a catastrophe in the way that word is usually understood. It was not a single event, not a volcanic eruption, not an asteroid, not a flood that rose in a day and receded by nightfall. It was slower than that, so much slower that the people living through it may not have recognized it as an ending at all. A lake that was full last season is a little lower this season. A patch of grass that fed a herd for 3 months now feeds it for 2. A river that once ran year-round now runs only after the rains, and the rains come later each year, and some years they do not come at all. The end of the Green Sahara was not a scream. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind of breath a sleeping body releases just before it settles into deeper rest, the kind of breath that changes everything without making a sound. The earth was not dying, it was adjusting. It was shifting its weight from one position to another the way a dreamer shifts beneath a blanket, and in that shifting, an entire world, green, wet, alive, was quietly folded away. The mechanism was orbital. Earth's axis does not point in the same direction forever. It wobbles a slow gravitational wobble, caused by the pull of the sun and moon on the planet's equatorial bulge. This wobble, known as precession, completes a full cycle roughly every 26,000 years, and as it progresses it changes the angle at which sunlight strikes different latitudes during different seasons. Around 10,000 years ago, this angle was such that the northern hemisphere received more intense summer sunlight, which heated the land surface of North Africa, enough to draw moisture-laden monsoon winds northward from the tropics. Rain fell on the Sahara. Lakes formed, grasses grew, life flourished, but the wobble continued. The angle changed. The summer sunlight weakened by fractions of a degree per century. The monsoon rains retreated southward, not suddenly, not violently, but with the inexorable patience of a tide going out. And as the rains retreated, the green followed them, leaving behind a landscape that slowly, grain by grain, became the desert we know today. But the drying was not perfectly gradual. Within the long decline, there were moments of sharper change, pulses of aridification, that hit like sudden drops in temperature on a cooling evening. Around 8,200 years before the Common Era, a massive release of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic disrupted ocean circulation patterns and triggered a brief but intense cooling event across the Northern Hemisphere. The effects reached North Africa as a sudden reduction in monsoon strength. Lakes that had been shrinking slowly now shrank rapidly. Communities that had been adapting gradually now faced acute water stress. Archaeological evidence from this period shows abandonment hearths left cold stone circles, left unfinished settlements left empty as their inhabitants moved toward more reliable water sources. The 8.2 kiloyear event, as climatologists call it, was not the end of the Green Sahara, but it was a rehearsal, a preview of the larger collapse that would follow over the next 2,000 years. A second pulse of rapid drying occurred around 5,900 years before the Common Era. This event was more severe and more sustained. Pollen records from lake sediments across the Sahara show an abrupt decline in grassland species and a corresponding rise in desert-adapted plants. Dust deposits in ocean cores off the coast of West Africa spike sharply, indicating that enormous quantities of topsoil were being stripped from the continent and carried out to sea. The lakes that had sustained pastoral communities for millennia shrank to puddles, and then vanished entirely. The crocodiles died. The hippos died. The fish died in mud that hardened around their bones like plaster casts, preserving the exact moment of their ending, in a medium that would last for thousands of years. The Green Sahara did not fade. In its final centuries it collapsed, and the collapse drove the largest human migration in African prehistory. They moved east, they moved toward the Nile, not in a single wave, not as an organized exodus, but as a slow generational drift, families and clans and herding groups filtering through the narrowing green corridors that still connected the drying interior to the river valley. They brought their cattle, they brought their grinding stones, they brought their knowledge of the sky and their habits of stone arrangement, and their memory of a world that no longer existed behind them. The Nile Valley, which had previously been a marginal environment, swampy, flood-prone, difficult to settle now, became the only viable landscape in a region that was rapidly turning to sand. The migrants transformed it. They drained marshes, they dug channels, they planted crops in the rich silt left behind by the annual flood. They did not invent agriculture from nothing. They adapted techniques learned over centuries of managing water in a landscape of seasonal lakes and unpredictable rain. The Nile did not teach them to farm. The dying Sahara did. This is what a reset looks like. Not destruction, but transformation. Not an ending, but a transfer, a vast slow pouring of knowledge from one vessel into another. The way water poured from a cracked jar will find a new container, if one is available. The Green Sahara was the cracked jar. The Nile Valley was the new container. And the knowledge that flowed between them, astronomical observation, water management, stone-shaping, communal organization, spatial planning, became the invisible foundation upon which Egypt was built. The reset did not erase what came before. It compressed it. It concentrated it. It took 5,000 years of distributed, decentralized experimentation and funneled it into a narrow ribbon of fertile land along a single river, creating the conditions for a density of knowledge and population that had never existed in the region before. Think of it this way. A forest fire does not destroy a forest. It releases the nutrients locked inside old wood and returns them to the soil where they become available to new growth. The new forest that rises from the ash is not the same as the old forest, but it carries the old forest within it, in its soil chemistry, in its seed bank, in the mycorrhizal networks that survived beneath the surface. The drying of the Sahara was Egypt's forest fire. It burned away the visible world, the grasses, the lakes, the scattered settlements of pastoral herders, but it drove the invisible world, the knowledge, the skill, the accumulated wisdom of millennia, into the roots of a new civilization that would grow taller and more enduring than anything the Green Sahara had ever produced. And here, in this quiet moment between worlds, something worth noticing: the people who lived through the reset did not experience it as history. They experienced it as life. A grandmother telling her grandchildren about a lake that used to be larger, a herder walking a little farther each year to find grass, a family deciding one dry season to move closer to the river and not go back. The reset was not a chapter break in a book. It was 10,000 ordinary days, each one slightly different from the last, each one carrying a small, almost imperceptible shift in the direction of a future no one could see. This is how the world changes. Not with announcements, but with adjustments. Not with catastrophe, but with breath, one long slow exhale that rearranges everything while everyone is looking the other way. The earth breathed out. And when it breathed in again, Egypt was waiting on the banks of the Nile, built from the memory of a world that had already returned to dust. Nothing truly disappears. This is not philosophy. This is physics. Matter changes form, energy, changes state, water, becomes vapor, becomes cloud, becomes rain, becomes river, becomes sea. But nothing is ever fully lost. The universe does not delete, it transforms. And the same principle applies to knowledge, to skill, to the quiet habits of hand and eye that one generation passes to the next without ever writing them down. The Green Sahara is gone. Its lakes are sand. Its grasses are dust. Its people left no monuments, no inscriptions, no royal tombs filled with golden furniture. But they did not vanish. They echoed. They echoed forward through time, through the bodies and hands and habits of the people who carried their knowledge to the Nile, and those echoes are still audible today if you know how to listen, not with your ears, but with your attention pressed close against the surface of things, the way a doctor presses a stethoscope against a chest, listening for the rhythm beneath the rhythm. The first echo is architectural. When the earliest Egyptian builders constructed mastabas, the flat-topped rectangular tombs that preceded the pyramids, they used a technique that Egyptologists call alternating course construction, layers of stone, interspersed with layers of packed earth or mud brick, creating a structure that distributes weight evenly and resists lateral shifting. This technique appears suddenly in the archaeological record of the Nile Valley, around 3,500 BCE, fully formed, as if the builders already knew what they were doing, and they did because the same technique appears in the stone and earth walls documented across the Western Sahara, in the rectangular enclosures near the Ahaga Mountains in the foundations carved into the sandstone of the Tadra Carcass. The method did not originate in Egypt. It migrated there, carried in the muscle memory of builders who had spent centuries learning how to make walls stand in environments where the ground itself was unreliable. The mastaba is not an Egyptian invention. It is an echo, a refined, scaled-up echo of a building tradition that began in a world of seasonal lakes and shifting sand, a world that no longer exists except in the structures it left behind, inside other structures. The second echo is celestial. Egyptian temples and pyramids are famously aligned with astronomical precision the Great Pyramid to true north, within a fraction of a degree the Temple of Karnak to the winter solstice, sunrise the Temple of Abu Simbel to the equinox. This precision is often presented as a uniquely Egyptian achievement, a product of the sophisticated priestly class that developed along the Nile during the Old Kingdom. But the roots of this precision reach much further back. At Nabta Playa, stone alignments dating to 9000 BCE already track the summer solstice. At the Jado Plateau in Niger, stone rows match the heliacal rising of Sirius around 7000 BCE. Across the Sahara, small stone circles and standing markers demonstrate an awareness of solar and stellar cycles that spans millennia. The Egyptian astronomers who aligned the pyramids did not discover these principles. They inherited them. The knowledge arrived at the Nile inside the bodies of migrants who had watched the sky from open plains for 5,000 years, who had encoded celestial patterns into stone arrangements so simple they looked like accidents to anyone who did not understand what they were measuring. The pyramids point to the stars because the people who planned them descended from people who had been pointing to the stars since before the desert existed. The third echo is hydraulic. Egypt's mastery of water, the canals, the irrigation basins, the nilometers that measured flood levels with extraordinary accuracy, is one of the defining achievements of its civilization. But water management did not begin with the pharaohs. It began with reed-lined pits in the Fayum dated to 5200 BCE. It began with stone-rimmed basins at Nabta Playa, reinforced by human hands to hold seasonal rainwater. It began with shallow channels cut into the Nile Delta soil, straighter than any natural drainage pattern guiding floodwater into cultivated areas, centuries before the first irrigation decree was carved into stone. The annual flood of the Nile became the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, but the understanding of how to work with water, how to store it direct, it anticipate its movements, was not born on the riverbank. It was born beside ephemeral lakes in a dying savanna, where miscalculating the timing of rain meant not inconvenience but death. The hydraulic engineers of dynastic Egypt were heirs to a tradition of water management forged under conditions far more demanding than anything the predictable Nile flood could offer. The Nile was generous. The Sahara was not. And it was the Sahara's harshness that taught the earliest water engineers the precision that the Nile's engineers later perfected. The fourth echo is symbolic. Before hieroglyphs existed, marks appeared on pottery on bone, on small stone tablets found scattered across Upper Egypt and the Western Desert. These marks are not random decorations, they repeat. They follow patterns. They appear in sequences that suggest counting or ownership or seasonal notation. Parallel lines, small circles, angled strokes, intersecting crosses. They do not form a readable script, but they form something, a proto-language, a system of symbols used to record information in a world without writing. When hieroglyphs emerged around 3300 BCE, they appeared with a complexity and sophistication that has always puzzled scholars. The transition from no writing to full writing seems too fast, too complete, too assured. But what if it was not a transition from nothing? What if hieroglyphs were the flowering of a symbolic tradition that had been developing quietly for thousands of years, carried on pottery and bone and stone across the Sahara and into the Nile Valley, by people who had been recording the world in marks long before anyone thought to call those marks a language? The earliest hieroglyphs are not a beginning. They are an echo of something older, a missing alphabet that spoke in circles and lines before the gods were given names. The fifth echo is the quietest and perhaps the deepest. It lives not in buildings or stars or water systems or symbols, but in the human body itself. Studies of skeletal remains from early Nile Valley settlements show physical traits consistent with populations from the southwestern desert bone structure, dental patterns, and nutritional markers that link the first Nile farmers to the last Saharan herders. The echo is biological. The people who built Egypt were in a very literal sense the people of the Green Sahara. Their bones carried the memory of a world that had vanished. Their hands carried the skills of ancestors who had shaped stone beside lakes that no longer existed. Their eyes carried the habit of watching stars from horizons that were now buried under sand. Every technique they used, every alignment they calculated, every wall they raised, and every channel they dug was an echo, a reverberation of knowledge that had travelled thousands of kilometres and thousands of years to arrive at the banks of the Nile, where it would finally be written down and given the name of Egypt. But the echo does not belong to Egypt alone. It belongs to the silence before Egypt, to the unnamed, unrecorded, unhonoured generations who watched and measured and built and moved and carried and taught, without ever knowing that the world they were building would be credited to someone else. There are echoes in every stone at Giza. There are echoes in every temple aligned to the solstice. There are echoes in the very idea that human beings can shape the earth to mirror the sky. And tonight, as your breathing slows and the weight of sleep presses gently against your eyelids, that echo is here too, in the rhythm of this voice, in the cadence of these words, in the ancient patient pulse, of a story that has been trying to be heard for 10,000 years. Let it reach you. It has travelled a very long way. There is a shape that the modern world prefers, and it is a straight line, a line that begins at a fixed point called the past, and moves forward without deviation toward a point called the future. On this line, things get better, tools improve, knowledge accumulates. Civilizations rise from simplicity toward complexity, from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward understanding, each generation, standing on the shoulders of the one before it reaching higher, seeing farther, building more. This is the shape we are taught in schools. This is the shape that organizes our textbooks, our timelines, our museums, our sense of who we are and where we came from. It is a comforting shape. It is a shape that makes the present feel like a pinnacle, a culmination, the highest point on a graph that only goes up. But the evidence in the stone tells a different story. The evidence in the stone tells a story shaped not like a line, but like a circle. Consider the pattern. Around 10,000 years ago, a culture emerged in North Africa that understood astronomy well enough to align stone structures with solstice points. They managed water. They organized communal labor. They developed symbolic systems of communication. They shaped stone with precision. They built not pyramids, not temples, but the conceptual foundations of pyramids and temples, measured spaces, oriented pathways, structures placed in deliberate relationship to the sky. Then the climate changed. The rain stopped. The knowledge was carried to the Nile, where it was compressed, refined, and scaled up into one of the most impressive civilizations the world has ever seen. Egypt rose. Egypt built. Egypt recorded its achievements in stone and papyrus and gold. And then over centuries Egypt declined. Its knowledge fragmented. Its institutions weakened. Its great buildings fell into disrepair, were buried by sand, were stripped for stone by later cultures who did not understand what they were dismantling. The knowledge did not disappear entirely. It echoed into Greece, into Rome, into the Islamic Golden Age, into the European Renaissance. But with each transfer, something was lost, the way a photocopy loses resolution with each successive generation. The pattern is not a line moving upward. The pattern is a wave, rising, cresting, falling, and rising again, each crest carrying the memory of the one before it, each trough erasing just enough to make the next rise feel like the first. This pattern repeats across the ancient world with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians appeared with writing mathematics and monumental architecture that seemed to emerge fully formed, as if built upon foundations that the archaeological record could not find. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro displayed urban planning and hydraulic engineering of remarkable sophistication, and then vanished, leaving successors who did not match their predecessors' skill for centuries. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization produced colossal stone heads and complex calendrical systems before declining into obscurity, their knowledge partially absorbed by the Maya, who absorbed it partially into the Aztec, each iteration carrying echoes of something older that could never quite be fully recovered. The pattern is not unique to Egypt. It is global. It is cyclical. It is the shape of how human knowledge actually moves through time, not in a straight ascending line, but in circles that overlap and intersect each revolution, carrying forward some portion of what the previous revolution achieved, while inevitably losing the rest to the erosion of centuries. The reason we resist this pattern is not scientific. It is psychological. A circle offers no pinnacle. A circle offers no destination. A circle suggests that the civilization reading this sentence tonight is not the culmination of a long upward journey, but merely the current point on a turning wheel. A wheel that has been turning for longer than any single culture has existed. A wheel that will continue turning long after the names we know have been forgotten, the way the names of the Saharan skywatchers have been forgotten. This is not a comfortable thought. It does not flatter. It does not reassure. But it is perhaps a more honest shape than the line we have drawn for ourselves, a shape that accounts for the anomalies, the silences, the sudden appearances of sophisticated knowledge in places where no known predecessor existed, the equally sudden disappearances of entire traditions that seem too advanced to simply stop. The builders before Egypt understood this shape. They must have. They watched the stars long enough to observe precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the positions of constellations over a cycle of 26,000 years. They watched long enough to see that the sky itself moves in circles, that the stars return to the same positions after epochs so vast they exceed the lifespan of any civilization that has ever existed. If they understood the circular motion of the cosmos, they may have understood in a way that we have only recently begun to rediscover that the motion of human knowledge follows the same shape. What rises will set. What is built will be buried. What is known will be forgotten. And what is forgotten will eventually be found again by someone standing at the same point on the circle, looking up at the same stars, asking the same questions that were asked 10,000 years before. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for humility. The circle does not diminish what the builders achieved. Not the Saharan herders, not the Nile engineers, not the pyramid architects, not the astronomers of any age. It places their achievements in a context larger than any single timeline, a context in which knowledge is not a possession but a current, something that flows through cultures the way water flows through landscapes, shaping everything it touches but belonging to no one. The pyramids are not the beginning of human architectural achievement. They are a point on a circle. The knowledge that built them came from somewhere older, and the knowledge that they contain will go somewhere newer, carried forward by echoes that have not yet been heard. Let this pattern settle over you now like a blanket woven from very old thread. You are part of this circle. Your curiosity tonight, this quiet listening, this willingness to drift through deep time is itself an echo of the same impulse that drove the first skywatchers to place a stone on open ground and wait for the sun to touch it. The circle has not stopped turning. It will not stop. And somewhere in its long rotation, the knowledge that was lost will surface again the way water surfaces after travelling underground, for miles, emerging clear and cold and carrying the mineral taste of every stone it passed through in the dark. The earth does not change without speaking first. It always warns. It warns the way a body warns before illness, with small signals, subtle shifts in rhythm that are easy to ignore precisely because they are small and subtle. A headache before a fever, a tremor before an earthquake, a single yellow leaf on an otherwise green tree before the first frost. The warnings are always there. The question is never whether the earth spoke. The question is whether anyone was listening. And in the millennia before Egypt, across the Green Sahara and the Nile Delta, and the high plateaus of North Africa, the earth spoke clearly and repeatedly to the people who lived upon its surface. Some of them listened, some of them moved, some of them adapted, and some of them left marks in the stone that suggest they understood what was coming, long before it arrived, not because they had instruments or satellites or computational models, but because they had something older, and in some ways more reliable. They had attention. They had generations of accumulated observation. They had the patience to watch slow things happen, and the wisdom to remember what they saw. The first warning was botanical. Pollen records extracted from ancient lake sediments across the Sahara show a gradual but unmistakable shift in vegetation beginning around 7000 BCE. Grass species adapted to regular rainfall begin to decline. Species tolerant of drought begin to increase. The change is slow, imperceptible within a single human lifetime, but across centuries it forms a clear trajectory. The land was drying. The grasses knew it before the people did, because grasses do not have the luxury of denial. They respond to the water that's actually present, not the water that was present last year, or the water that might return next season. A grass plant that does not receive enough moisture simply stops growing and dies, and its absence is a sentence written on the landscape in a language that anyone who depends on that landscape can read. The herders of the Green Sahara depended on grass the way a sailor depends on wind. When the grass changed, everything changed. The second warning was hydrological. Lakes began to shrink. Not dramatically, not the sudden draining of a basin overnight, but measurably year by year, the waterlines retreating from their former edges like a slow tide that never returned. Archaeologists have found settlement patterns that track this retreat with remarkable precision. As lake levels dropped, camps moved closer to the remaining water. Stone circles that once sat at the margins of large lakes now sit in the middle of dry basins, their positions marking shorelines that no longer exist, the way a bathtub ring marks a water level that has long since drained. The people followed the water inward, concentrating around shrinking resources, and in that concentration lie the seeds of both innovation and conflict. When water is abundant, communities can afford to spread. When water contracts, communities must either cooperate more intensely or compete more fiercely. The archaeological record suggests that both responses occurred simultaneously, larger communal structures appearing alongside evidence of abandonment, as if some groups chose to organize and others chose to leave. The third warning was astronomical, or rather the response to the astronomical was itself a warning. The stone alignments and circles built across the Sahara were not decorations. They were instruments. They tracked the movements of the sun and stars with a precision that only matters if the information being tracked has practical consequences. The summer solstice alignment at Nabta Playa did not exist for aesthetic purposes. It marked the onset of the monsoon rains, the annual pulse of moisture that sustained the entire pastoral economy of the region. When the rains arrived on time, the alignment confirmed what was expected. But when the rains arrived late or arrived weaker than expected or did not arrive at all, the alignment became a warning. The stones did not move. The sun did not change. But the rain that was supposed to follow the solstice, the rain that had always followed the solstice for as long as anyone could remember, began to falter. The gap between the celestial signal and the terrestrial response widened year by year, and that widening gap was itself a message written in the language of absence. The sky said, rain. The earth said dust, and the people who stood between them watching both understood that something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface of their world. The fourth warning was geological. As the vegetation retreated and the topsoil dried, erosion accelerated. Wind stripped the surface layers from exposed ground, carrying fine particles eastward in dust storms that would have been visible from enormous distances, great amber walls of airborne sediment moving across the plains, like slow, silent curtains being drawn across a stage. These dust events are recorded in ocean sediment cores off the coast of West Africa, where layers of Saharan dust appear in increasing thickness, beginning around 6000 BCE. The dust itself was a warning, a physical manifestation of the land surface being dismantled and carried away. Every grain of dust that left the Sahara was a grain of soil that would never grow grass again. The land was not just drying, it was leaving. It was being exported particle by particle into the Atlantic Ocean, where it settled on the seafloor and became part of a geological record that would not be read for another 8,000 years. The fifth warning was the quietest, and it came from the animals. Bone assemblages from archaeological sites across the Sahara show a gradual shift in species composition over the millennia of drying. Large water-dependent animals, hippos, crocodiles, large fish species disappear first from the record. Smaller, more drought-tolerant species persist longer. Cattle bones remain, but show signs of nutritional stress, thinner walls, less dense marrow evidence of animals that were surviving but not thriving. The herders would have seen this in their livestock before any scientist measured it in a laboratory. A herder knows the condition of their animals the way a parent knows the health of a child, through daily observation, through touch, through the subtle language of appetite and energy, and the quality of milk. When the cattle thinned, the herders knew. When the wild game moved south, the herders knew. The animals were warnings written in flesh and bone and breath warnings that required no translation for anyone who lived close enough to the land to feel its pulse. And here is the part that matters most, the part that connects these ancient warnings to the silence of this present night. The people who received these warnings did not ignore them. They responded, they moved, they adapted, they carried their knowledge eastward toward the Nile, and in doing so they preserved something that would otherwise have been lost completely. The warning was not wasted. It was heard by people who had spent generations learning to listen, learning to read grass and water and stars and dust and bone, and their response to what they heard became the foundation of everything that followed. The earth warned. The people listened. And because they listened, the knowledge survived. Tonight, as you breathe slowly and the edges of wakefulness soften into something quieter, consider this: the earth is always speaking. It speaks in the same language it has always used, the language of slow change, of small signals, of patterns visible only to those who pay attention over long stretches of time. The question is the same now as it was then. Not whether the earth is warning, but whether anyone is still listening. There is a relationship so old that no one remembers when it began, a relationship between the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your head. It is not a metaphor. It is not a spiritual abstraction. It is a physical fact as measurable as gravity, as observable as the shadow a stone casts at noon. The earth turns. The stars appear to move. The sun traces an arc across the sky that shifts with the seasons, and that arc determines where light falls, where heat gathers, where water flows, where crops grow, and where the ground is warm enough to sleep on under open air. The sky tells the earth what to do. The earth responds. And the people who first noticed this relationship, who tracked it, measured it, and coded it into stone were not poets or priests. They were survivors. They watched the sky because their lives depended on it. And what they learned from watching became the invisible architecture upon which the visible architecture of Egypt was eventually built. Begin with the simplest observation. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. This is so familiar that it seems trivial, but for the earliest human communities it was the first fixed line in a world of uncertainty, a constant in a landscape where water moved, animals migrated, weather shifted, and the ground itself could change from season to season. East and west were not abstract compass directions. They were the endpoints of the one line in the sky that never failed the one axis around which everything else could be organized. When early groups in the Sahara built stone circles with entrances facing east, they were not performing a ritual. They were anchoring their world to the most reliable feature of the cosmos. East was where certainty lived. East was where the light returned every morning without exception. East was the fixed point against which all other measurements could be made, and the act of orienting a structure toward the sunrise was the first architectural decision older than walls, older than roofs, older than the very concept of a building. Orientation came first. Everything else followed. From this single axis a geometry unfolded. If east and west defined one line, then north and south defined the perpendicular and true north. The point around which the entire sky appeared to rotate became the ultimate reference. Finding true north without a compass requires patience. You must watch a star near the celestial pole trace a small circle over the course of a night, and you must identify the centre of that circle, which does not correspond to any single star, but to an empty point in the darkness around which everything turns. The fact that pre-dynastic observers identified this point is attested by the alignments they left behind cairn lines in the Fezzan region of Libya that run north-south for kilometres, stone corridors in northern Sudan that track meridian lines, standing stones in the eastern desert, placed at intervals along ridges that follow the polar axis. These alignments were not approximate. They were precise enough that their errors when measured today fall within the range attributable to the slow drift of the pole itself over millennia. The sky moved. The builders accounted for it. They understood that the reference point was not fixed but migrating, and they adjusted their marks accordingly, a feat that implies not just observation but observation sustained across generations. Knowledge passed from parent to child to grandchild in an unbroken chain of watching. The marriage of sky and earth reaches its most visible expression at Giza, where the Great Pyramid deviates from true north by approximately 3 arc minutes, an error so small that it was not surpassed by any structure on Earth until the modern era. This precision is often attributed to the genius of Old Kingdom architects, and rightly so, but genius does not emerge from vacuum. It emerges from tradition. The architects who aligned the Great Pyramid inherited a method, a way of reading the sky and translating its geometry onto the ground that had been refined over thousands of years by people who left no blueprints, no instruction manuals, no names. The pyramid is not the invention of its builders. It is the culmination of its builders' inheritance. Every arc minute of its accuracy represents centuries of prior observation, conducted on open plains by watchers who had nothing but their eyes, their patience, and the clear dark skies of a world without artificial light. But the relationship between sky and earth is not only geometric, it is temporal. The sky is a clock, the oldest clock, the most reliable clock, a clock that has never stopped and never will. The annual motion of the sun marks the seasons. The monthly motion of the moon marks shorter cycles. The heliacal rising of specific stars, particularly Sirius, whose appearance above the eastern horizon just before dawn coincided with the annual Nile flood, mark the most critical moment in the Egyptian agricultural calendar. This star, which the Egyptians called Sopdet, was not discovered by the Egyptians. It was watched long before them, tracked by stone alignments on the Jado Plateau, and at Nabta Playa, where its rising was marked thousands of years before the first pharaoh connected it to the flood. The Nile flood was predictable because the sky was readable, and the sky was readable because generations of unnamed observers had spent millennia learning its language, a language of angles and intervals, and returns a language spoken in light and silence, and the slow turning of the earth beneath a canopy of stars that never asked to be worshipped but only to be watched. Tonight the sky is above you still. The same stars turn, the same relationships hold. Orion still rises in the east, Sirius still follows. The pole still marks the centre of the sky's slow rotation. The marriage between sky and earth has not ended. It has only been obscured by city lights, by ceilings, by the comfortable illusion that the ground beneath us and the sky above us are separate things, unrelated, disconnected. They are not. They never were. The people who understood this first, who pressed stones into the ground to mirror what they saw in the sky, gave us the foundations of orientation, navigation, calendrics, and architecture. They gave us the ability to place ourselves in space and time. They married the sky to the earth with nothing but stone and patience, and the pyramids that rose from that marriage are still standing, still aligned, still pointing towards stars that have barely moved since the day the first watcher lay down on warm limestone, and looked up and began quietly to measure the distance between here and forever. There is a sensation that has no precise name in any modern language, the feeling of arriving somewhere for the first time and knowing without reason, without evidence, without any logical explanation that you have been here before. It is not memory in the ordinary sense. It is deeper than memory. It sits beneath the surface of conscious thought, the way bedrock sits beneath soil, invisible, unfelt, but structurally essential, holding everything above it in place. The Greeks had a word that comes close, anamnesis, the remembering of things the soul already knows. The Egyptians had no single word for it, but they had an entire civilization built upon the principle that the past is not behind us. It is beneath us. It is inside us. It returns. And the feeling of return of cycles, completing of patterns, repeating of the wheel, coming around again to a point it has already touched, is not an illusion. It is one of the oldest forms of knowledge the human species possesses, older than writing, older than architecture, older than the very idea of history, as a record of things that happened once and never again. The builders before Egypt understood return. They had to. Their entire world was governed by it. The sun returned every morning, the stars returned every year, the rains returned every season until 1 century they did not. The cattle returned to the same grazing grounds along the same paths their ancestors had walked, and the herders who followed them returned to the same campsites, the same stone circles, the same waterhole edges where their grandparents had knelt to drink. Return was not a concept for these people. It was the structure of reality itself, the shape of time as experienced by anyone who lives close enough to the earth to feel its rhythms directly without the insulation of walls and clocks and calendars printed on paper. Time for the earliest inhabitants of North Africa was not a line. It was a breath, in and out, rise and set, flood and drought, green and dust. The same motions repeated with variations so slight they only became visible across generations the way the precession of the equinoxes only becomes visible across millennia. Everything returned. And in that returning everything was both new and ancient simultaneously. This principle of return is embedded in the very stones of Giza. The pyramids are not just tombs. They are not just monuments. They are instruments of return structures designed to facilitate the cyclical journey of the pharaoh's soul through the underworld and back into the sky, following the same path the sun takes every night when it sinks below the western horizon and travels through darkness before rising again in the east. The architecture of the pyramid mirrors the architecture of the cosmos as the Egyptians understood it, a journey downward into depth through narrow passages of transformation, and then upward again toward light. The ascending and descending passages inside the Great Pyramid are not merely functional corridors. They are spatial representations of the cycle of return, the same cycle, observed in the sun, in the stars, in the flooding of the Nile, in the growth and death and regrowth of crops planted in the rich black silt. The pyramid does not point upward toward a destination. It points upward toward a return toward the place, in the sky, where the cycle begins again. And the cycle does begin again. This is the part that the modern mind resists most strongly, because the modern mind has been trained to think in terms of progress, of advancement, of forward motion toward destinations that have never been reached before. But the evidence, geological, astronomical, archaeological, suggests that the deepest patterns of human civilization are cyclical. Knowledge rises, is refined, reaches a peak, is lost, and rises again in a different form in a different place, carrying fragments of what came before. The builders of the Green Sahara developed astronomical knowledge that was carried to the Nile and refined into the precision of the pyramids. That precision was carried to Greece and refined into the geometry of Euclid. That geometry was carried to Rome and refined into engineering. That engineering was lost in the medieval period and rediscovered in the Renaissance, partly through Arabic translations of Greek texts that had themselves been informed by Egyptian knowledge that had itself been informed by Saharan observation. The circle turns, the knowledge returns, but it never returns in exactly the same form the way the sun never rises at exactly the same point on the horizon 2 days in a row. Each return carries a slight variation, a small shift, a new angle on an old truth. The cycle is not a trap, it is a spiral, a circle that moves through depth, with each revolution touching the same points, but at different levels. You have felt this return tonight. From the very first sentence of this journey, something in the rhythm of these words has felt familiar, not because you have heard them before, but because the pattern they follow is older than any specific set of words. The pattern of slow revelation, the pattern of descent into depth followed by quiet resurfacing, the pattern of questions that do not demand answers but simply open spaces in the mind where understanding can settle on its own schedule the way sediment settles in still water. This pattern is not an invention of storytelling. It is the pattern of the earth itself, the slow turning the patient, returning the endless repetition of cycles that feel both ancient and immediate, both finished and beginning. You are inside that pattern now. You have always been inside it. The builders who placed stones on the open plains of a green Sahara 10,000 years ago were inside it too. They did not build monuments to escape the cycle. They built monuments to mark their place within it, to say quietly in the only language that outlasts speech, we were here. We watched. We understood that the world turns, and we trusted it to turn again. Let that trust settle into your body now. Let it press against your chest like the warm weight of a stone that has been holding sunlight all day and is now releasing it slowly into the cooling air. The return is not something you need to achieve. It is something that is already happening in the rhythm of your breathing, in the beating of your heart, in the slow drift of your thoughts, as they loosen from the surface of wakefulness and begin their own quiet descent into the deeper places where dreams are made from the same material as memory. The cycle has no edge. It has no ending. It simply continues the way the stars continue, the way the stone continues, the way the dust of the Sahara continues to drift across the Atlantic and settle on ocean floors where no one sees it, but where it accumulates grain by grain into layers that future geologists will read the way we read the layers beneath Giza, with wonder, with humility, and with the quiet recognition that we are not the first to stand here, and we will not be the last. There is a moment just before sleep arrives when the body stops being a body and becomes something closer to landscape. The muscles release their hold on the skeleton, the way sand releases its hold on a dune when the wind changes direction. The jaw softens, the hands open, the weight of the head settles into whatever surface supports it, with a trust so complete it resembles geology, the slow, unquestioning surrender of one material to another, calcium pressing into cotton, the way limestone presses into the bedrock beneath it, layer resting upon layer, each one held by the one below. This is the moment we have been moving toward all night. Not a conclusion, not an answer, a settling. The way dust settles after a long wind, the way silt settles after a flood, the way 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge settles into the ground and becomes invisible and becomes permanent and becomes the foundation upon which everything visible is built. You have travelled a great distance tonight without moving. You have stood on a plateau that was green before it was golden. You have watched stars from a sky unpolluted by any light except the light of the stars themselves. You have felt rain on limestone that has not felt rain for 8,000 years. You have followed the slow migration of people who carried their knowledge eastward like seeds carried in the lining of a coat, small, hidden, unremarkable, until they find soil and water and begin quietly to grow. You have seen evidence accumulate like sediment. You have sat with anomalies that refuse to resolve. You have listened to the silence where the record disappears and felt perhaps that the silence is not empty, but full of everything that was built from materials too soft to survive, full of names, spoken in languages that left no alphabet, full of knowledge that did not vanish, but transformed the way water transforms into vapour, and vapour transforms into cloud, and cloud transforms into rain that falls on ground it has never touched before but that recognises it instantly, the way the earth always recognises water, the way stone always recognises the hand that shaped it. You do not need to remember any of this. That is the deepest lesson the ancient builders left behind. They did not build for memory, they built for presence. The stones at Nabta Playa do not ask to be remembered. They simply stand. The grooves in the limestone do not demand interpretation. They simply exist. The alignments that point towards stars that have shifted position over millennia do not require belief. They simply measure. The builders understood something that the modern world has largely forgotten, that the most enduring things are not the things that are remembered, but the things that are absorbed, taken into the body, taken into the ground, taken into the slow, deep rhythm of a world that does not need to be understood in order to be trusted. So let yourself be absorbed now. Absorbed, let the knowledge you have received tonight sink below the surface of conscious thought, the way water sinks into sand, the way roots sink into soil, the way the memory of rain sinks into stone and remains there for millennia, invisible but structurally present, shaping everything from within. You are not separate from this story. You are not a listener standing outside it. You are part of the sediment. You are part of the layer. You are part of the long, slow accumulation of human attention that began when the first watcher placed a stone on open ground and looked up and understood without words that the sky and the earth are one thing, and that the space between them, the space where breath lives, where light falls, where bodies rest and dreams begin, is not empty. It is the oldest architecture there is, and you are inside it now. Breathe, settle, become stone. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The plateau is quiet now. The stars have completed their slow arc overhead, and the ground beneath you, that ancient patient limestone, has given all the warmth it stored during the day. It is cooling now. You are cooling with it, and that is exactly as it should be. You do not need to remember what was said here tonight. Not the names, not the dates, not the sights or the stones or the stars that were mentioned across these long and quiet hours. The words were never meant to be memorized. They were meant to be absorbed the way rain is absorbed by limestone, the way warmth is absorbed by skin, the way a rhythm heard often enough stops being something you listen to and becomes something you breathe with. 14,000 words have passed through you like water through sediment. What needed to stay has already settled. What needed to pass through is already gone. You do not need to sort them. You do not need to hold them. The deepest layers form themselves. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. The builders who came before Egypt did not understand everything either. They did not need to. They watched. They placed stones. They trusted the ground to hold and the sky to turn. That was enough. It carried them across millennia. It can carry you through one night. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Let your body press into whatever surface holds it, the way stone presses into the earth beneath it, without resistance, without effort, without the need to be anything other than what it already is. Heavy, warm, still, held. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch.